It's time to price the promises, where we analyze key pieces in the party platforms. Last night, the Conservatives did release costing information on most of their platform, which totaled out to about $51 billion. The only platform costed by the parliamentary budget officer. The Tories planned on nearly matching the Liberals in $78 billion in new spending, but the Conservatives plan to save $27 billion by cutting the Liberals' $10 a day childcare program. So what's included in the $51 billion costing? Well, $7.6 billion for a job creation program, $9.7 billion for fiscal stabilization for the provinces, and $24 billion to double the tax credit for low-wage workers over 5 years. But what about some of the big ticket items, like the party's personal carbon savings account and the promise to inject $60 billion into healthcare transfers? To help break it down, let's bring in Sahir Khan. He's a former assistant parliamentary budget officer, nowadays the vice president of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Sahir, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
So your institute grades platforms. You've given the costed Conservative platform a passing grade. They rated good on realistic economic assumptions and transparency, but a fail for responsible fiscal management. Why the fail?
Well, I think it's important to say the way we assess these platforms. It's not about who's going to be fastest to eliminating the deficit, because we think that's some kind of a mythical beast that everyone thinks they have to slay. It's a political target. It doesn't have as much economic public finance value as I think it's given credence. But what we did look at was, do these parties in their platforms, the costed platforms, do they include prudence? For example, there's a pandemic going on. We need to protect against downside risk. Do we see a fiscal rule in place? And do we have any kind of considerations for the long-term risk? And so the Conservatives and Liberals both had pluses and minuses in them, but the fact is that the Conservatives actually left a number of holes in their platform that actually suggest that there might be more risk in the longer term to fiscal sustainability than, say, with the Liberal platform.
All right, well, one glaring omission from the PBO costing is the Conservatives' personal low-carbon savings account. So this is a key pillar of their climate plan, where fuel consumers, like drivers, would be credited points toward green purchases. It's a bit convoluted, but how much do you think setting up that program would actually cost here?
Well, I think there are two things. The cost of it is really unknown right now. We don't have a costing from the PBO on this. What I think I'd be more worried about is the complexity of it, because you're switching from established market mechanisms for like a carbon tax and the way rebates can be applied back to homeowners to something a lot more complicated that involves the government kind of running this program or creating another instrument. So when we look at these promises, we don't just look at how much are they going to spend, but how complex is the implementation of the measure. And this one actually looks to be relatively complex on its face. And without a costing from the PBO, you're kind of adding to a little bit of the uncertainty associated with the strategy.
Here's another one not included in the costing. The Conservatives promised to boost the health transfer to provinces by $60 billion over 10 years, and they're going to back-end that money in the later half of the decade. So, of course, there we go, dependent on the Conservatives winning re-election. Your read on that, and whether the inclusion of that basically, sort of blows up the platform's price tag?
Well, this is actually one of the reasons why they failed the fiscal management test from the IFSD assessment. There are two issues around this escalator. Number one is, it was stated to be $60 billion, but really it's back-end loaded. And that's okay. I think if it's transparent that it's back-end loaded, it's really not a signature measure in the context of this medium-term plan, which is 5 years. But I think just as important, and perhaps more important from a fiscal point of view, you're taking something that's now going to grow at a 6% rate, compounded, with no promise that you can end it after 10 years. So one of the things we worry about in long-term fiscal sustainability is, are you promising spending measures that are actually to grow faster than the economy is going to grow over that period? So that ability to kind of close that gap and ensure that you've got a declining debt to GDP over that period starts to be put at risk. And many of the measures the Conservatives have in the platform are actually front-end loaded, they're short-term, and they're kind of time-limited, which gives us a great deal of certainty fiscally. But this health transfer actually added a great deal of uncertainty to this platform. And frankly, it's up to voters to decide whether a back-end loaded $60 billion health transfer is really the promise that they're making, that they've made in the platform.
Hey, one last question, bigger picture. The Conservatives often push the narrative that they are the best ones to handle the Canadian economy. The key takeaway here for you when you looked at the platform?
I think the reality is what these assessments tell us that nobody's got a monopoly on that. I think handling COVID, the IMF has said that the federal government actually prevented significantly worse economic outcomes by injecting the amount of money that they did into the economy. So I think this is about context. It's about, we've seen in the past Liberal governments institute program review and establish the very good, sound fiscal structure that we have. So I think putting a label on fiscal prudence is probably a bit of a mistake, something I've learned over the years. That's one of the reasons why we do this assessment, to say, does the front end and the back end kind of match up, and do voters are they going to get what they've been promised?
Sahir Khan joining us with the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Great to see you again. Thanks for taking the time.